Welcome to Tabadla's Policy Roundtable on COVID-19 and the lessons for digital policy. Thank you so much for coming here. And I know it's a little tricky because we're all concerned about COVID-19, but we're hoping that this conversation that you are all a part of and people on our live stream are a part of as well is going to be a catalyst for further discussion and debate on how to improve Pakistan's digital policy. My name is Amber Shamsi. I'm a head of communications at the Bad Lab. And I mean, this is the obvious, stating the obvious. COVID-19 has fundamentally changed how we interact with people, how we travel, how we work, how we get entertained, for instance. And I mean, what once in a century pandemic doesn't, right? But I think what we really need to sort of understand is, well, events like this, for instance, are a reflection of how this change has come about. I mean, this is part virtual, part real as well. And it's the year of the pandemic, we've all been sort of involved in Zoom meetings as well. I mean, I've interviewed a couple of you over Zoom as well, some in person. So this mix, we've gotten used to it. But what's at the heart of this, what connects all of this is connectivity, obviously, and how that connectivity helps us during these difficult times and improves our interactions, the way we work, the way we get educated, the way we get entertained as well. I'm not going to do a long introduction, but just opening remarks will be made by Musharraf Zaidi, who's a senior fellow at the Bad Lab. We have Jehan, founder and CEO at Nest.io. We have Amer Hashmi, who's the chairperson of Special Technology Zones Authority. We have Naureen Hyat, co-founder of Teys Financial Services. We have Amer Ibrahim, Chief Executive Officer of Jazz, and Irfan Wahab, Chief Executive Officer, Telenor Pakistan. We're hoping that this conversation, this interconnection between business and policy and government will lead to a very fruitful discussion. Over to you, Musharraf. Thank you.
Bismillah. Thank you, Amber, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone that's here in the room. We've deliberately tried to keep it a very small group in order to be aligned with COVID-19 sort of SOPs, although as one of the panelists was saying prior to us getting started, I think we've psychologically in this country defeated COVID. And what that means is that it's rare to actually have this kind of sort of spaced out event. But I think it's important that we continue to do this until we know that the majority of Pakistanis are vaccinated. Hopefully, a bunch of folks are joining us through the live stream, and people will have an opportunity to continue to come back to this conversation and to try and use it as a reference point, to try and frame how to think about digital policy in the future of this country from a digital perspective, as we try and garner and learn lessons from the experience of the pandemic. As you can see, and frankly, we could replace, with due respect to the panelists, we could replace any number of 4 or 5 folks sitting with us here live with folks sitting here. We have people from the telco sector, from the startup community, from the media among us, and we have a similar representation here on stage. I don't want to take up too much time, but just to help frame why the Bad Lab is doing this and what our interest is in this. So as a think tank, that really wants to engage with difficult to grasp questions, it feels like digital policy is the ideal question. The digital transformation, because of its massive impact both on society and on the economy, both already the existing impact and the potential impact. It gets a short shrift in terms of how policy deals with it for many reasons, most of which are legacy reasons. We're operating on an iOS that is first or second gen in terms of how states work, but we're dealing with questions and challenges that are very much 4.0. They're happening here and now. And there's no country or no system that has found the formula for how to cohere all these different forces, all these different impetuses and imperatives. So we want to try and curate a conversation about digital transformation in which I think the COVID-19 framing is a useful one in terms of lessons learning, but this is the first of hopefully many interactions in which we'll get a chance to learn from industry, from government, and from the startup community. Digital, of course, from an economic standpoint, is also an interesting convergence of technology and financial services, and we've seen a bunch of things happening in the financial services area with respect to digital. Naureen, I want to maybe start off with you because I think it's important to acknowledge some of the good news that I think this country has seen, especially over the last 60, 70, 80 days. I know that has nothing to do with the fact that that's around the time that Ahmed Hashmi took over the STZA, and we won't give him any credit for that, because how can we do that? He's part of the government now, so he's on the other side. But Naureen, we've seen Rast, that's come up. We've seen some of the changes the SECP has made. We've seen the changes the State Bank of Pakistan has instituted in terms of technology startups, their ability to own assets abroad and to move money back and forth. It seems a lot is happening. All of this was, the precursor was the e-commerce policy, which in a sense in draft form had been kind of sitting there, gestating, I suppose, absorbing the different, I don't know, the haldi and the garam masala in the air in Islamabad. And then suddenly there was action and the Ministry of Commerce pushed it through. So without being too celebratory, is it right to say that suddenly and somehow Pakistan has figured out that digital financial services are at the heart of the future of economic growth, or is that being too optimistic, Naureen? And maybe before you answer that question, tell us a little bit about yourself and what TEZ does, because I know, and folks here know, but not everybody that's watching will.
Sure, thank you. Well, beginning with TEZ. TEZ is a fully digital financial institution. Technically, we like to call ourselves a neobank, and we provide a full stack of services to the and the underbanked. All this through a smartphone. And what we're really doing is banking on the digital railroad to integrate the masses into the financial mainstream. And this includes services such as digital credit, nano loans. We're bringing in digital savings, insurance, and ultimately investments. So that's very quickly what TEZ does. And we have been, working on this, well, since 2015. The company started really in 2018. So I think the concept of digital has been looming around since a while now. And I think understanding whether or not it's at the center of how the digital economy will move, I think it's still a matter of perspective. And honestly, as much optimistic as I'd like to be, I think I'd also like to be realistic about it. It's very important to not be in denial. I think that definitely some great moves have been made. COVID, I feel, has been a blessing in disguise for digital financial services. Whether or not that sustainability or that critical mass has been achieved, I don't think so. Definitely, I think this is a first step towards it. But it calls for an integrated ecosystem where a lot more has to be done. And we're just at the first step right now. So I'd say, in digital financial services, two big breakthroughs happened in Pakistan. One was, when EasyPaisa started. And then, of course, a lot of others followed. There was Jazz, Omni, and the likes. So I think that was the first breakthrough in digital financial services, which happened back in 2015 when it really started. And I think the next breakthrough now is Rast, which I personally feel will bring in great ripples for the financial sector to grow on. And as we do understand, Rast will definitely change the way payments are done. It will bring in an entire new ocean of entities that can operate on it. But the power of Rast right now, I think people will realize with time how intense it is, if put to use correctly. It will help bring in more use cases, something that we talk about very often when we talk about digital financial services. So I think for us, the important conversation has to be connectivity, yes, is key. You talk about interoperability, it's key. But now it's time to think about connectivity, and transform it to value creation, which is what will bring in that wave of digital financial services or financial inclusion, the way we try to look at it. And I feel, the pillars that really need to be worked upon, for me, there are three main areas, when you talk about digital policy, that are of key significance. You talk about accessibility, that can include scale or affordability. The second one for me would be efficiency, the speed and integrity of transactions. And then the third one, which is key, is adoption. And that will only come in through the different sorts of use cases that we want to build upon that digital ecosystem. And I think we're still beginning to do that. We talk about trying to enhance the payment transactional activity. And we see with Easy Pesa having done, even Jazz having done some great work on building those platforms to encourage digital activity. But that digital activity and that adoption will only come when the masses understand, or there's a need for them to actually start adopting that. And you talk about things like digital credit banking on those platforms that will ultimately bring in the people into that mainstream. So I think still a long road for us ahead. This is the very first step. We need a lot more that has to go into this from the digital ID side of things. NADRA has to play a big role, I feel. There's a lot that has to be done on centralized databases, something that we talk about often, but nothing much has been done on it. We talk about centralized KYCs, and then of course data repositories. So I think these are elements that have to be worked upon, and still, there talks about it, but we need to do a little more, a little faster than we are doing it at.
So Naureen, you haven't wasted any time, and you've gotten right to the sort of, the heart of the matter, which is why I began with you, because often these conversations, I think they dance around some of the core issues a little bit before we get into the meat. And you can blame Naureen for this, Irfan, but I'll come to you next and ask you. She talked about adoption as a key sort of underlying thing that needs to happen before all of this begins to build up in the right way. And there's likely no better two individuals to be sitting with us today than you in terms of representing Telenor, and Amer in terms of representing Jazz, given the size of the community that you serve in terms of your users. Would it be unfair of me to ask you, perhaps framed this way, that I can't quite figure out whether the failure in terms of a much quicker adoption, Naureen is saying we're still at the first step. I feel like we've been at the first step since at least 2014-15. So what is the explanation? Is it that the telco service providers have not done enough to push out services to their user base? Because the differential between your total subscribers and the use of some of these technologies, it's still a big gap. I know it's closed, and maybe talk a little bit about whether COVID-19 helped in closing that or not, in your view. Or is the blame or the responsibility, or at least some of the responsibility, partly lying in public sector decision making? One big opportunity that I thought was missed was the Asas and BISP cash transfer program, where we did see long lines, and I think there's good reasons why BISP and Asas made those decisions, and those are their decisions, but ultimately it was an opportunity missed, and I think with RAS they may be seeing a way to plug that gap. But where does the burden of responsibility lie as an observer and an actor in this whole dynamic?
No, it's an excellent question. I think responsibility lies on all of us, because no single company or business or sector can hold all the burden on its own. Because here we're talking about digital transformation for the entire society. It's not just about basic connectivity, which we have done quite well as a telecom sector. If you think about it, how far we have come in the last 15 years, I think it's one of the key success stories. We are at times very critical of ourselves, but if you look at what we've achieved as in this sector, it's also a sad fact that we have mobile phone in more people's hand than people having access to clean drinking water in this country. So that shows that at least from connectivity and basic connectivity, we reach out to more people, far-flung areas. But that's not enough. Because this journey is far from just delivering minutes and megabytes. Now it's about those moments which people can cherish and utilize, whether it's e-learning, whether it's financial payments, or even entertainment. So there we are talking about a true transformation and building an ecosystem where everyone has to play its role. So if I take a step back and say what else we can do better, at least making sure that we have better connectivity and better experience, I would say fundamentally, we, in this country at least, it's a mobile first experience. So over 90% of the people experience internet through mobile, right? How can we improve that? And there's fundamentally, if you look at, we all as a telco operators or wireless operators ride on spectrum, which is the backbone. It's a highway of connectivity. And if you look at how much spectrum we have allocated in Pakistan compared to region and regional markets, we've only deployed 1/3. Yeah. If you compare with Europe and all that, I mean, and each country, US has the same amount of spectrum as we, but we are just saving it for future, which is for beyond belief, I would say, because we are not deploying that resource. So it's about thinking that what we can do through digital, what are the opportunities, and you talk about the potential in your opening as well. I think there are numerous studies, you guys have done your study as well, around the potential of digitization in a country like Pakistan. We cannot transform, at least in our lifetime, education through brick and mortar. We cannot transform financial inclusion, where still 80% of people don't have access to traditional banking through traditional approach. We need to really embrace digitization. And that's why we're saying that telecom is not just one sector. We have to think beyond. This is sector of sectors, which is enabling education, health, commerce, agriculture, you name it. And that's how we need to start thinking. And for that, it's responsibility of everyone. Public sector, private sector, academia, NGOs, everyone, we all have to come together and really see what are the irritants, so spectrum being one from a telco viewpoint. Then it's availability of the smartphones, where still we have about 40% smartphones, 60% people don't have those, so they cannot even access internet. And then we need to really do a deep dive how we can make it more affordable, what sort of taxes, etc. And then comes on top of that the use cases, which Naureen also mentioned, which I think we have come, and RAST is a great example, and also, there are other enablers which will really make sure that there is enough innovation in the startup community. And it's not just large corporates which can do it. We need to really give space to startups as well to think, innovate, solve those problems. But that journey, this will be a journey. I think we have started a journey, but there's a lot more which can be done. Yeah.
On the spectrum issue is an interesting one, again, from a COVID-19 perspective. When the pandemic hit and it was obvious that there's going to be a significant impact on connectivity, the way that we've tried to frame it is that COVID-19 was an attack on connectivity. And I frame it in that very deliberately, in the sense that, I think we've gotten used to public policy being framed around security, which, aside from good or bad, is a fact of life in this country. And so to think about connectivity as an attack on our ability to connect with each other, our ability to conduct transactions, our ability to deepen commerce and benefit from each other, financially, economically, socially. When this attack took place, and the pandemic was clearly an emergency, one would think that the public policy response would be, okay, what can we do to make sure कि ये जो impact है इस connectivity का, या disconnectivity का, we can mitigate this impact. Spectrum would have been one area, one thing that we found in our discussions with you, with friends at Zong, at the other telcos, obviously with Jazz, talking to everyone, was that the pandemic response initially declared a few essential services, and telco was not, among them. It's not about an industry; it's really about connectivity, and yet, the public sector missed that opportunity. Rather than criticizing, what do you imagine are the reasons why government doesn't, on its own, initiate the idea that, okay, let's expand the spectrum for a little while at least, let's make it a bit cheaper, let's drag the telcos in, we'll charge them later, but at least for COVID-19, we can take advantage of this opportunity, not just to expand the spectrum, but also to expand who is benefiting from it. So why doesn't that happen automatically?
I think, and again, if I be totally candid, I think you need to really understand the full potential of what you can do through this, how you unleash. You need to take the full ownership and take certain decisions. And this is not unique, right? So, other countries have also looked at it. And first of all, let me just also correct this impression. I think telecoms was declared essential services fairly quickly.
A month after the pandemic emergency.
But much quicker than some other countries. And we have actually seen the benefit compared to some other countries in the region. Philippines, India came a lot later. So our IT industry has really benefited from that. But when it comes to spectrum, there are 24 countries which we have seen at least and also shared and asked our regulator and policymakers around the world, right from US to Pacific, who have immediately released additional spectrum because they see that the world is, the connectivity become a lot more important. And we made some specific suggestions, and it's not that we don't have spectrum. Like I said, we have ample spectrum available, but then what we saw is that lack of that ownership and lack of that vision. And I think still we feel that this is not fully understood, that how this digitalization should be driven from the top. We've seen models which are successful around the world, say Malaysia as one example, India could be other, where it's been driven at the top by the Prime Minister's office. Because there's so many silos within any government organization. There are so many of those ministries and bodies and authorities who do not talk to each other. They're just protecting their own shop. And that's the only way that you create a national emergency, I would say. I mean, because just this was an emergency in pandemic, and then how you really make sure that SMEs are connected, how you make sure that all the kids who are out of school or colleges, we can provide them connectivity. It was not seen as a national emergency. We tried to do, again, in our own right, whatever we could do as a small business in a larger scheme of things, but this has to be done together. So that's what we missed out. But this is, again, what we can learn from it. Because this is not, I think we still can do a lot. We can still catch up. There's still a lot of opportunities where we talk about demographic dividend. We talk about 100 million young people. We are the fourth largest freelancing nation, but our kids are earning maybe $4 an hour, not $40 an hour, because we never taught them what is in demand out there. Rather than upskilling them to do coding in terms of data analytics, in terms of credit scoring, in terms of machine learning, they're still at the basic level. So just by providing them exposure, also providing them mentoring opportunities, creating that ecosystem will create opportunities domestically, but it will also create opportunities where they could become really a very valuable knowledge workers.
So let me take that sort of proposition and pose it to Jehan, to you. You've been kind of a curator for the technology community in this country for the better part of 2 decades, and your role, I think, is widely acknowledged, though you may be humbler about it in how you see it. But instead of praising you, I'm actually going to pose maybe a slightly challenging question, right? The way that Irfan has talked about it and Naureen have talked about it, it seems that one of the failures in this country, at least, and I think in many other countries, so it's not just to pick on us, but we're obviously invested in Pakistan being successful, is this connection between the potential that sometimes, Amer, Ibrahim will talk about, you will talk about, other telco operators, and certainly the startup community talks about it all the time. They're talking about this potential and also kind of complaining that the government doesn't recognize or understand this potential. And so I would turn that gun probably back at us and say, okay, well, whose responsibility is it to explain and sell this potential? And maybe one of the challenges is the cohesiveness of the wider digital community. So, Irfan and Amer and others are responsible for the highways and for keeping the roads running, right? And so we can definitely, if we see a highway that isn't working, there's not a connecting road, we can maybe ask them about it. So we could blame them for maybe the USF not being more active. We can blame the USF and government, but we can also say in remote areas, Pakistani connectivity isn't what it should be. And so there's a lot of people missing out on 4G connectivity. And I'll give you a chance to respond to that as well. But when it comes to the cars on the highway and how fast we drive and who is sitting in those cars, that's really a technology community responsibility. Naureen is applying that in one specific sector. Is it unfair to say that the wider digital community does not have its game together and has not been successfully been able to encash this vision and sell it to decision makers in the state?
So that is a very important question, and I think it's not from want of trying. I have seen, and it's not just about me, because nice of you to say that I've been part of this industry for the last 2 decades, but there are a lot of people who were there before me and have come in after me who've played a very important role and continue to do so. I have seen the kind of engagement they've had, that we have all had with the government. And now with these task forces, I know the Prime Minister himself said, these task forces have done nothing. But the thing is, I think everybody needs to understand that in an advisory role, there is only advice that you can give. The execution still lies with the government, with various organizations also in the private sector, and with us. So as Irfan said, very rightly so, it's all of us who are responsible for things not happening. The technology industry is still a very small industry in Pakistan. One of the reasons for that is, although there are many successful companies, they have not been able to grow to the extent that they could have for several reasons. One, the amount of local taxes, the bureaucracy, everything, the documentation that is needed, also lack of local customers, especially within the government. So when you don't digitize the government, you keep the private sector that is involved in technology from working on large projects, which they can use as part of their portfolio in order to sell to outside customers. That hasn't happened much in Pakistan, even now.
And where it has, it's been enormously successful, like Nadra, right?
Well, Nadra was not private sector.
No, I'm saying that when government did something that was using technology, outside customers came and sought Nadra as a vendor for solving the same problems in other places.
Absolutely. And we do have companies who've worked on large projects outside Pakistan, but not enough of them. Secondly, the resources to be developed by government. So our universities haven't developed the kind of resource in the numbers that we need. And that's sad, because there's no lack of talent in this country. But you need to educate them, and I think Naureen, was it you or Irfan said, you need to teach them the right things. You cannot continue to teach people something that is no longer a need, either for technology or other companies in Pakistan or outside. So you cannot bid for projects unless you have people trained enough to handle them. Now, many companies have taken this on themselves and are training people internally, but there is, it's a problem of scale. You cannot have scale unless you have the money, unless you have the incentives that need to be in place for even private sector companies to do that. It's begun to happen. I don't want to lay the blame on government or anybody in particular, but the thing is, we need to collectively do what needs to be done without saying, oh, so-and-so didn't do this in the past, that minister didn't do this, that Pasha representative didn't do that, or that telco didn't move fast enough. It's all about all of us. And unless we, figure out that this is something we need to solve together, it's not going to happen.
Do you feel that COVID-19 has helped push this notion of all of us together forward in any way, or is it being to use Naureen's framing, is it being too optimistic? I'm, by the way, guilty forever of being overly optimistic, but has COVID-19 pushed the envelope a little bit, or not?
It has. And
in what way?
I'm an optimist as well, so
I know.
Even if you move that much, I figure it's better than not moving at all. It has, because in several ways. One, the government has realized that we need to digitize. Because for delivery of services to the consumer, to even corporations or within government organizations, they found how difficult it is if you're not digitized. Because COVID suddenly brought them face to face with that. Secondly, listen, just as much as government is to blame, so are corporations. Large corporations never saw the need to adopt technology. They had, yes, their ERP systems and what have you, but using it for their teams, or using it for remote working, using it so women who were working from home could have that comfort of knowing that they didn't have to be in offices 9 to 5. That's not what many corporations did. There were some leaders who did that, but most of them didn't. And now suddenly when COVID-19 hit and they said, oh God, how do we continue to do what we do as a company? And we have to work remotely because we are organizations and we've been told you're not part of essential services, then they have to do it. And so they've started adopting remote work, they've started training their people, all of that has begun to happen, and the technology industry has been helpful in training a lot of these people because they just didn't know how to go online. They didn't know how to train their people online. They didn't know how to do the work that they normally did in an office space remotely and online. Yeah. So I think it's been good for the technology industry. It's been good for everybody realizing that we need to do this together. But there's still a far way to go. We need to keep working and keep acknowledging that this will happen. The second, I think, I don't know whether this is the second or the third thing, taxes need to be reduced.
Let's come to the taxes in a second because it's, I think, an easy target with the people here that we'll talk about. We will talk about them, okay. But I want to include Amer Hashmi Saab and Amer Ibrahim Saab in the conversation. Starting with you, if it's okay, Hashmi Saab. If we could go back to the previous, thank you. We framed this conversation within the COVID-19 context for a very specific numbers-based reason. If you look at total data usage, the difference between 2019 and 2020, 77% increase in data usage. Net, that's huge. It's a massive increase. Mobile banking has gone up by a full 100%. E-commerce has increased by 56%, and these are all pre-RAST, pre-SBP, pre-SECP, pre-reform, pre-STZA sort of numbers. So I guess the proposition is that COVID-19 did have an impact. Certainly as far as the user was concerned, the telco service providers were concerned, the app makers, the cars on the highway, improved. Do you, having just taken over this new role, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about STZA as well and what the actual vision is. But having just taken over this role, would it be unfair for us all that are gathered here today and folks watching to expect massive increases in these numbers a year from today, given that the platformification of these numbers has already been set? So in a sense, you've been given a very fertile ground upon which to build massive success. And what are the key challenges you feel you will face in the role that you're in terms of delivering that?
Thanks, Musharraf. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks for having this session. I think it's very timely. And I did go through the paper your team had sent, and it concentrated more on the connectivity side. But I see the discussion is a little broader. So I'll address from a government perspective, and then of course as an entrepreneur, because I've had that role as well, and of course my mindset hasn't changed because I've been in the government for the last 10 years as well. And as Janara put it, an advisor is an advisor. You can't have implementation. My new role, I have some powers to implement stuff as well. So I'll explain from a government context now. So I'll start off with Niyat, awareness, and just time, right? So 2 years of the government, and I think most of us here, including a lot of think tanks, have had a lot of pressure on the government. Me being non-politically affiliated, I look back from things, and I've been part of a think tank as well. And the parameters that we've gauged the success of, let's say, technology, telecommunications, science, education, human capital development, that's kind of all related together. So the awareness that I felt to be pushed to actually talk to them came in September. Not because of COVID. My awareness had come 20 years ago when I moved back to Pakistan. So COVID, I thought, was a phenomenal opportunity because Pakistan was behind globally on a lot of indexes, not just the Human Development Index. So when you're down, and when the globe is going through a transformation, there's a financial crisis, then when you're setting up the lowest in the region in terms of development, you have a lot that you can do on a fast track basis. So one of the things that I had proposed in September, and this is very new, and I'll say was driven by the Prime Minister, what is happening in technology, right? And of course, telco, as we've mentioned, the highway, the road, everything that technology and data run on is, of course, the highways, so important. So I had some concerns on where we were going because I felt that you'll hear numbers from 1.5 billion export to 1.5 million domestic industry, plus minus various a bit. Freelancers, cash sitting outside of Pakistan, you'll hear we've got a lot of freelancers, they don't want to bring money related to taxes, but a lot of bureaucracy as well. So as far as IT was concerned, I felt we could be at about $5 billion today, right? And it hasn't happened, especially with a progressive mandate that the new government was bringing. And the crux of it, my own self-belief, because I'd spent a lot of time in the industry, although I know Irfan has shared that it's everyone's responsibility, but the state, as per our constitution and most constitutions around the world, the state has to be the leader. And the reason the state has to be the leader, it of course has the financial resources, it has the land allocation, right? And it's got people, it's got access to global markets that entrepreneurs or the private sector does not have. So I felt that the state should lead it. Of course, there's different varying views on that. And now I feel, if your question, and I wrote that one down that you asked, Irfan, why government doesn't think that this was an emergency. So I rephrased it. I wrote, was your question, why isn't the government proactive, not just in COVID, but why doesn't it, education, healthcare, it's not built that way, and we all know it. So I don't think that's a fair question. We know the answer. Government is not built, whether it's the US government, Pakistan government. Chinese is a little different in the last couple of decades. So it's not a proactive government. A lot of private sector entrepreneurs here, what does Jazz and Telenor have to do to make their employees proactive? Incentives. There's no incentives in the government. You can stay in your job role for as long as you want, we all know that. But the exciting thing now, so kind of, we all know what the background is. You're a think tank, you've done a lot of research on that. I've been pushing for 10 years strategic reforms. And strategic reforms, in my definition, means the operation and execution of our government. I don't think that's optimized, right? And I think inshallah we'll get there, and technology can be an enabler for that, right? But the mindset, jo maine kaha niyat beginning mein, I think the mindset has started changing, and the reason why, the ministries, everyone knows, they have federal secretaries, we all complain that they get shift really quickly because they don't have domain expertise. So the federal secretaries, I think probably everyone sitting in this room, kind of in the same age group bracket of the late 40s, mid 50s, some I can see in the 30s here. The federal secretaries now are aware about IT. I had time. So when I came back to Pakistan at the age of 30, when I'd sit with federal secretaries and 3-star generals, bahut mushkil hota tha. It'd take me a lot of time just to explain what tech was. And Janara was there. She understood it. Of course, she was head of Pasha. But now they're getting it. One presentation I made, in which I won't share everyone was there, but it was to the PM. And immediately he said, "Theek kaise karenge ye cheezein?" So I said, okay, give me another couple of days, I'll come up with solutions. Because it was just to show him why we're hurting. So when he responded purely on merit in the sense that he wanted to see what could help the economic growth on a fast track. Because textile industry se sun chake the, Pakistan Business Council se sun chake the, agri ka, tech pe he couldn't understand how we can get to 5, 10, possibly $15 billion quicker. So I was quite candid, and I shared legislative. It's the issue of the government. How do you fix that? And then you said share a bit about STZA. So a couple of people talked about taxes, but taxes is just one of it. Your issue in government is your spend itself, which Janara touched upon. So you're not going to get manpower trained until you have mega, multi-million-dollar contracts awarded to Pakistani companies in Pakistan. How do you learn? The HR development, high end of tech mein kaise aayegi? I don't know who used the example of $4 to $40, right? So software development is billed on an hourly basis, as we know, but systems integration, IT outsourcing, these are mega $100, $200, $300 million deals that Infosys, Wipro, Tata, TCS, we've heard, the big giants there, they're pulling not software development, they're pulling entire IT outsourcing deals into Bangalore, and of course now many other cities in the country. So when you get to $140 billion, it doesn't come just from software services. Networks run kar rahe hain, data centers run kar rahe hain. Ab wo capacity building kaise hui? Of course, it took 2 decades. So the fast track approach, in my opinion, and STZ is one of the mechanisms. We'll have to bring the whole sort of 10 strategic ministries in the government together to make this happen. So the STZ basically will do is, it's saying what the Chinese and of course Silicon Valley did in the 60s, is here's a land parcel, right? And Pakistan mein reforms nahi ho sakte, and the excellent example of what Deng Xiaoping did is he took, I think, almost 50 executives from the Central Party, and he took them around the world for about 40 days, I think in the early 80s, and to understand what free economy meant, free markets meant. Came back and said, China can't reform, so let's pick Shenzhen, right? So poor fishing village, and he said, Shenzhen, although will report into Beijing, this will have different regulations that Silicon Valley had. Europe bhi gayi, wahan se bhi seekha. Or of course, it started manufacturing, but the last 2 decades have been in tech. So it is now the 3rd largest economy after Shanghai and Beijing, Shenzhen, just in 2 decades. And tech is driving it. So when we talk about digital, my own opinion and many others that sort of pushed why we need special regulations, and hence the word special technology zones, these land parcels or areas or clusters or science parks, whatever, there's many names for it. And I'll share the ordinance with you so you can share with all the audience as well, is we need an enabling environment and lessons learned to move the economy on fast track. So it's a knowledge economy. You invite professionals. Tech zones mein educational institutes hoti hain. Higher education ki bhi, lower colleges like TAFTA and stuff, they also should be there. Research institutes hote hain.
Okay, so not to, because I want to keep the conversation flowing, Hashmi Sahab, specifically in, I mean, this is a really exciting, I think, for a lot of us, an exciting opportunity, STZ, and what you're describing. Do you feel that the COVID-19 experience, that there are actually any lessons that you can draw to inform things moving forward? Or do you think, like you said earlier, a lot of this was well known, and so really COVID-19 is an opening for others to be interested, but for insiders like yourself, you're just going to go ahead and power through?
Yeah, COVID sort of dhakka de diya.
Okay.
In other words, but for us to attract business and investment, yes, COVID's a factor. Right now, in the US, for example, a lot of mid-sized companies, the big boys, the Oracles, IBMs, Microsofts, they're okay.
Yeah.
But the mid-sized companies in the US, mid-sized are $100 million to 500. They have huge cost cuts on IT. They need to outsource. India saturated, of course. Philippines has done well. Bangladesh has done well. So you have to become a catching mitt. You need to attract work and knowledge workers. You need diaspora back. When diaspora moves back, they bring back knowledge and their clients. So when a person who's been at a C-level in the US comes back at the age of 50, he's bringing about $5, $10, $15 million of cash. He or she is bringing his global network. He's bringing his credibility, morals, ethics. But in Pakistan, wo darte hain ki will we survive here? So what did China do? What did Korea do? They built areas where knowledge transfer could take place seamlessly in a one window. The challenge will be, so we're piloting soon, and I'll share later on in the conversation. In the tech zones, we're going to pilot, is this one window going to work? The Ministry of Commerce, imagine, Ministry of Interior, FBR, SCCP, the State Bank of Pakistan, all the regulations that are in it's law now. And now we have to make it work, inshallah. So I think, yes, because of COVID and because of the mindset change coming now, and I think it'll get much faster in 2 years, because we have to deliver. The government has to deliver. I think tech can be your driver for fast-track economic growth, and I have no doubt about it.
Thanks. I think that's a really helpful sort of, especially to learn a little bit about STZ. And again, exciting that we'll have this island of excellence. But Amer Ibrahim, finally to come to you. Islands of excellence are relevant, again, for many reasons. One of them is lesson learning and then taking what we learned there and applying across the country, as Hashmi Sahab said. But I suspect that folks like yourself and Irfan, Wahab Khan and others that are driving and steering the telecom sector will not have the luxury of kind of banking on an island because you're all over the country. COVID-19, and especially for Jazz, I think this is particularly relevant because you're as big as you are. COVID-19, we've already talked about how it was an attack on human connectivity, undermined transactions. Yet, if I'm not mistaken, just today or maybe in the last couple of days, reports are that you guys still made a decent sum of money, more than decent. For me, it's a huge amount of money. But how was the telecom sector able to be profitable at a time when the spectrum allocations weren't ideal, or at least the boosts that we might have seen weren't there? The speed at which essential services, it was declared as an essential service, it was better than some countries, but not immediate, which indicates, a lack of imagination, I think, on the part of the public sector. With all of this happening, and with each user contributing so little to your bottom line because of the, you'll remember this, Amer, the calling party pays kind of regime essentially destroyed revenue because the telco firms in the early 2000s went to war with each other on pricing. And the result is the collateral damage is still felt today because the margins for each user are small. Luckily, it's a big country. It's going to keep growing. You have all of this, and yet you're still making money. And I have a question here. And the question is, despite doing well even during the pandemic, when I see the numbers around, for example, just if you take mobile ownership and the difference between men and women, women are at roughly 25%, 26% of all women have a mobile phone, and the equivalent number for men is 67%. That's not a small disparity, it's a massive one. We can blame culture, we can blame society, but ultimately it's the state's responsibility to enact legislation and policies that help steer it in a better direction. But I think as a visionary corporate leader, it must be a challenge for you as well.
So there were so many things, I don't know where to start from.
Start with women and disparities, and then talk to us a little bit about how you managed to make it all work from a COVID-19.
How you made so much money.
Oh, how I made so much money.
The money part.
Not me, the company. But let me start with another clarification of who we are and what we intend to do. And there was a lot of references to telecom versus digital and new. Telecom as a connectivity player, that journey is coming to an end. Yeah, it will always be important. Jazz will continue to build towers, sell SIMs. But that's not what excites us. That's not where our future is. Our future, as we see, is closer to the digital opportunities, the roads on the highway, not the highway itself. Yeah, we will continue to build the highway. And Jazz has a very clear intention of where we want to be. So we're not divorcing ourselves from our legacy or from what makes us successful today, but doing more of what we do, which is building more towers and just relying on that as our gravy train for future, is not going to be enough. So we are very conscious and very intentful about where do we want to pivot. We started off with financial services. Jazz Cash, has about 13 million customers today who make their payments from that. Our super app, Jazz World, has more than 3 million people who engage with us every single day. 1 million people watch television on Jazz TV. We recognize that digital in itself can be misconstrued by many different people, and connectivity is what we generally refer to when we talk about, well, we need to do better. Of course we need to do better, but that's not going to be enough. I strongly believe, as Irfan also mentioned, that we are a cross-sectoral enabler. So what that means is that we are a sector of sectors. We are laying the railroads which are going to be important. We are the electricity on which future success for every single industry is going to reside upon. And we need to invest disproportionately to make sure that those industries have a chance of succeeding. Agriculture will become agri-tech, finance has become fintech, education, edtech. How is that going to happen, even with COVID? There was an immediate pressure on us to provide connectivity to far-flung areas where we have no connectivity, and I can't automatically drop towers over there. That requires policy intervention. So in many different ways, COVID was an eye-opener for many governmental decision makers that we need to provide far-flung connectivity. Even today, more than 45 million Pakistanis have no signal, right? And USF alone will not be able to do that. But as long as we continue to think that telecoms are rich, they make money, and we milk them today, we're never going to think about the future. And that's the inherent disconnect between the three key important stakeholders: the investors, which is us, and the operators, the government, which needs money today, and the milk spectrum and many other regulatory taxes, et cetera, and then consumers who want better connectivity, internet, they want it faster, they want it everywhere, and guess what? They want it free. So it's a bizarre love triangle. I think there is a way that we can all be successful, but it requires intervention. We can't be neutral about things like this and then just expect that 2 years down the road, something miraculously different is going to happen, right? So I just wanted to get that out of my chest, that this is not an easy thing, and jazz of future is very different from how you see jazz today. We are more, we were a telecom company, we are a tech company today, and we intend to be a data company, which we think is the new goal. Now, we move on to the disparity, the more pointed question that you have. It's unfortunate reality. Even I just gave a mention of our digital financial inclusion. Only about 18% of women are our account holders. And I think it was only last week that I was on a forum with the state bank governor on the disconnect between ownership or access. And I again highlight, because not because I have a vested interest that I come from this platform or this background, but I think internet is a great enabler. Right? You can't just expect that just by having a counter dedicated to women in one of your total 18,000 branches, more women will come and open accounts, right? Because they still have to pass through the same uncomfortable street where there are going to be a lot of, uncomfortable eyes being cast upon them. It's not going to make them feel comfortable. You can provide that banking to the woman where she's comfortable in her home, right? That is not going to come from more branches or having dedicated women at a counter. That's going to come from having a Jazz Cash account. This is the opportunity that we had, and you alluded to it with BISP and ESAS program, where we doled out money to 10 million odd people. We could have done it instead of a limited mandate account. We could have just opened their accounts. However, let's not, lament over the past. Let's think about what we can learn and how we move. A smartphone ownership, again, is very negatively looked upon today, and it's getting worse in Pakistan. So we need to change that thinking. We need to allow women to, it sounds almost really bad when I say we need to allow women. They should have the right to be able to do these things, but because of our societal pressures, because they're not financially empowered, we still are a very patriarchal environment where the decision makers don't allow women to have smartphone. That is the necessity. That is one of the most important tools that we have, which is going to take our country forward. And to deprive women from having a smartphone is one of the biggest sins that we can commit today.
I couldn't agree more. I think that brings us, in a sense, back to the tax issue. And Jehan, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned taxation. I'm conscious that this shouldn't become a lament against taxation. Pakistan is a very large country with a very small number of very wealthy individuals and sectors. And so it's perfectly legitimate, in my view, for the state to want to impose certain tax norms that ensure that people are paying into the system reasonably. But it's also hard to defend the state when we see things happen that defy all sort of logic. On the one hand, we want to attract investors into SDZ. On the other, we're putting headlines that include shutting down telco operators' offices because of a tax dispute. I know that, it's Jazz and Telenor here, and I can pick up examples of how Telenor has been hounded, how Jazz, but frankly, so have Zong and UFO. This is an industry-wide thing, and it isn't really about one company. This is about, I don't even think it's about one sector. I think it's about a state that is looking for money, and wherever it sees money, वो फिर झपट्टा मारता है. मैंने वो जो profitability थी Jazz की या Telenor की, I mentioned that profitability not necessarily as a good thing, but out of fear, because the tax man, there might be representatives sitting here, with due respect, thank you for being here, but the tax man is going to see that profit and say, we knew these guys were making crazy money. Jao se aur paise nikalo. How do you find the balance between the legitimate interests of the state in taxing well-to-do and well-run businesses and the kind of thing that we've seen happen that diminishes Pakistan's attractiveness both as an FDI location but also domestically?
I think they need to be smarter about tax collection. Taxing the same person over and over, or the same type of organizations over and over, and saying, okay, they're paying 20%, let's tax them another 20%. Instead of that, broaden the tax base. How many types of individuals and organizations in this country don't pay tax. The majority, right? So I think what they need to do is to make it attractive for people to come into the tax net. And so when they tax Irfan or Amir's company, they're actually taxing me and users, because there's taxes on the SIMs, there's taxes on the bills, there's taxes on everything that's associated with it. So if I'm spending X number on my Jazz account, more than that is being paid in taxes by me. And then they're paying what they're earning from it, right? So I think they need to get past that. And as far as the technology companies are concerned, again, it's the same thing. You are taxing the people who have registered as taxpayers and not taxing the rest. So I think that they need to be smarter by making sure they lower the taxes and offer incentives so people will come into the tax net, and then they will have a larger volume of people paying more in taxes, and yet, so there will be a win-win from both sides, right?
I hear you, and I'm thinking of what this again, it's not specifically this government. These kinds of things have been done by every government. But just to quickly draw Irfan into this, Irfan, do you remember, I'm sure you remember, the new tax regime on super smartphones, on the high-end sort of iPhones, and having talked...
I paid today, actually.
Having talked to people about this, and I haven't gotten a new one because, I'm like, it's deathly scary, to look at those numbers. It wasn't just that we were taxing individuals, which I think a luxury tax is just fine. And if we're using phones as an indicator, that's fine too. But when you tax the specific ownership of that phone, you also have a downstream effect on mobile set usage and purchasing, do you not? Talk to me a little bit, if you can, about what impact that single decision from a tax perspective had on the growth of like the dumb phones and the basically suffocation of the smartphones.
I think we need to sort of differentiate the issue, as Jehan is saying, that, as a nation, we need to really broaden the tax base, right? So what is happening here is, say, telco as a sector, there are taxes like withholding tax, 12.5%, which is being charged on everyone, right? So you have a majority of the country or population or our users who are not in tax bracket. They have to, they're prepaid users, and there's a deduction there. What does it do is it takes away affordability, right? So and this is a disincentive to them to use technology, say, for education of their kids, or leveraging this towards, and all the other use cases which you're talking about. So I think that's a fundamental difference. Second difference is you have discriminatory taxes. Right, so you have a GST or a value-added tax for a sector which is 4, 5, 6% more than other sectors, and that's also put additional burden on the masses. We're not talking about the corporate tax here. I think that's fine with companies who are making profits, but for the consumers, it has to be. We talk about the incentives. We talk about reducing the barriers. The other example is, it's great that we have seen surge in digital payments, but we need to see how we make it more sustainable, right? So, as an example, pre-COVID, we were at 190,000 per day for financial transactions. It has gone up to over 700,000, close to 800,000, which is very encouraging. But one of the factors is also IBFT charges, which were waived, which is good for a limited period, but you cannot just waive it forever. That's also a form of tax, because if you look at all those things, they all add up. So we are absorbing a lot of cost because we have to really understand our own ecosystem. A lot of people still need to cash out those payments, right? So, and where to go? Because there are not enough branches, not enough ATM machines, they go to the agents. And we have rolled out, 70, 80,000 agents, which have to be paid commissions or incentives to carry that cash and available at their kiosks so that they can pay those people who come. So we have to pay them commissions. And not by sort of withdrawing this and still keeping it free is not helping building or sustaining the payment ecosystem. So I think as a policy, as we're discussing policy interventions, I mean, there should not be any discriminatory taxes as we talk about, especially for people who doesn't fall under tax bracket. It has to be simpler. Secondly, we need to think of the policy incentives which actually encourage and build sustainable. We all talk about potential, and there are studies which shows that the potential of only financial inclusion is about $45 billion in the next 5 years. But we cannot achieve it unless we remove those irritants, whether it's taxes, whether it's charges, regulatory fees, they all have to be streamlined.
Talk about a little bit, Naureen, about the streamlining. The absence of this streamlining, what effect does it have on your ability to grow your user base, and whether there's any, because I can think of a couple, but I don't want to introduce them in the conversation randomly. I don't know enough about it. Are there points of contact where there might be a conflict between your interests as a financial services firm that banks on digital connectivity and the provider of the highway or the road vis-a-vis the telcos? When I guess the question I'm asking is, when the two of you, Irfan and Naureen, are sitting in front of the regulator, do you have an aligned strategy and approach to what you want in terms of policy changes? Or are there areas where maybe you bump heads a little bit?
I think there's a lot of symbiosis that comes into how we look at it. At least, I think from our perspective, and we've integrated with all the mobile service providers, and definitely there's a sync in why we're doing that. But there's an interesting point that was just highlighted. We saw recently, the Punjab government brought in some, changes in the sales tax that is being charged on digital transactions. So there's an 11% discount on if you actually conduct a digital transaction. And I was in Lahore, and everywhere I went, I tried to encourage using my card. Well, there were people who knew about it. There were lots who did not. Some who were using it. But at the end of the day, you see, even on the merchant or the retailer side, cash is king. Liquidity is what matters to them at the end of the day. And that's something, even from a policy perspective, the reason why cash is king is, and I say this often, is because cash from a customer's perspective is still cheaper than digital. And that comes in with elements such as taxation, or the costs, for example, MDRs, things like that are something that are passed on to the retailer, the merchant at the end of the day. So they would definitely prefer cash. And even the customer at the end of the day, when you talk about cash in and cash out charges, why would he or she at the end of the day want to even get the money into the digital mainstream? They'd rather go on using cash because they have liquidity in their hand. But if you talk about, from a policy perspective, this I might be digressing a bit, but there was, we won this visa challenge in Paris, and when the money came in, we were literally charged 30% corporate tax on the funds that we had won. So this is how policy is really thought about over here. And I think there's just much more to individual transactions or partnerships. This problem actually starts coming in when you talk about FDI, for example. Jehan alluded to the fact earlier. That's a big cause of concern. One of the most integral elements here is how you bring that investment in, so that ultimately it can be deployed into entities like ourselves. You saw recently, an example of Geo and WhatsApp. Billions of dollars of worth of investment that came into India, and this is the kind of momentum that you really need to start building into this country. It's not only going to be about allowing startups to hold assets abroad.
Yeah.
There's going to be much more that's needed to actually drive that. And when you talk about an even investment, how many unicorns does Pakistan produce, unfortunately? When I'm not trying to be pessimistic about it, but the point here is that if you need to encourage even investments coming in or that critical mass to be achieved, there's a lot more that has to be done in collaboration. For example, incumbents and startups, or even the private and the public sector have to come together to drive that momentum. And until and unless that's not done, you can't expect things to just change over a day and expect things to just be all fairy tale.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. We have a few questions that are coming in from people that are watching that I'd like to sort of drag into the conversation. But just to maybe put a proposition to you, Amer Hashmi Saab, we're talking about cash is king, and I mean, there's many reasons why cash is king in sort of what we might call normal Pakistan. Is it possible to imagine, I don't want to put you on the spot, which is why I frame it in this way, is it possible to imagine that the geographical area that STZ is in charge of, that you would, I don't want to use the term ban cash, but will there be some policy incentive or some directive that it enforces the use of digital payments? Is that something you've even thought about? And if so, how are you thinking about it?
I think you'll be encouraged enforcing, no, but the comment you made about FDI,
Yeah.
I'll explain that in the relative
Please.
terms. She's spot on. So what we did, and let me explain how the government meetings went so you guys understand that what you're doing is fantastic. You guys have, when I said the state is from overseas back to Pakistan, starting the largest IT company in the country, and then coming to Islamabad to understand why our country doesn't function, right? So it's legislative. I'll keep repeating it. You guys have to push, and because we pushed, so if you're in the zone, just take TES for example. So the state bank reps were there first, and then finally the state bank governor. If you are a zone enterprise, it's the ordinance says zone developer or zone enterprise, and you're in there. So foreign exchange regulations as per state bank guidelines have been changed. So you can hold the VC funds who are not coming to Pakistan, because you said investors won't come. Whatever amount they deposit, they can keep them in dollars. They won't be changed into rupees. Tax holiday on that, 10 years. So now, what happened? When I keep telling about mindset change, the management at the state bank had to be educated. So अब जो generation आ रही है tech को वो understand कर रहे हैं government में. Same with the SECP, same with the Ministry of Commerce. So in the zone, the investments will be allowed. We've got 10 VC funds now. Finally, they're ready to come to Pakistan. The state may think about going 50-50 with them, and we create, inshallah, the first $1 billion fund. But it's a lot of work with legislators, right? To sit with them, to explain to them. And FBR, first they weren't allowing it. They said, no way. Or reason kya diya? IMF nahi allow kari. Tax on the industry. So then I said, acha, let me talk to them. I said, you allowed it in China. You allowed it in IMF. The programs of lending money have been all over the world. Why Pakistan doesn't get a tax paid on SEZs or STZs?
Yeah.
And now you're seeing what they're doing. So एक चीज़ जो हुई है on tax, because we're talking about tax, is the FBR and the cabinet has just approved a new unit that FBR is to be the collector. Policy वो नहीं बनाएगा. It's a new unit being made. कि आप experts लाएं, and not just government. So the positivity I'm seeing, like I'm also an external optimist, is the baby steps we're taking, I think in 2 years will be accelerated, inshallah, right? So TES comes into the zone, and we'll have multiple zones. It's not just one big zone, right? So there'll be clusters where there's smaller areas, and we want the investment to come. The government's understanding why it's important. And the biggest thing, guys, the government doesn't have cash. ये चीज़ें करनी पड़ेंगी to generate more revenue, to generate more employment. If we don't use innovative means, STZ is one example, don't allow digital to flourish in the country and transform the ministries. एक और digital चीज़ की भी मैं mention कर दूँ. Digital Pakistan का जो buzzword निकल आया था ना, when the government came in, digital typically when you do transformation meant कि आप ministries की business process re-engineering करें, gap analysis करें, and then you map the technology for a more efficient ministry. That's internal digital transformation of the government. The output is your services to, of course, the citizens of the state. So the digital initiatives now will get pushed heavily, right? They're the ministry's responsibility, but I think now the PM is contemplating how to start pushing कि ministry सारी digitization होए और delivery to the end customers भी होए.
Okay. I think that's really useful in terms of setting up a context and explaining where the government might be. Though I'm an optimist, I'll continue to retain some skepticism about how fast this might happen and all the different potholes or landmines on the way there. Amer, just to close up this round, and then we'll take in a few questions, but having heard these views, and some of it, I have to say, is kind of old hat, right? We know that there's a tax issue. We know that the government's not responsive. Some of it is genuinely new. I think clearly we have a consensus around COVID-19 as having pushed us in a certain direction. I think STZA is a new thing. And as skeptical as many of us might be, there's good reason for us to cross our fingers and be optimistic as well that we can create these islands. But Amer, Amer Ibrahim, the one kind of question that still kind of remains is the expanse of the base versus how advanced that base is in terms of what it adopts and what it uses. It's kind of where we started, and I wanted to close the loop with you, Amer. What can we expect firms like Jazz and Telenor, obviously speak for one, not the other, but what can we expect the telco sector in general to be able to do internally without, talking about regulations, taxation, government intervention? Is there anything more that you can imagine the sector can do in terms of bridging that gap between the very impressive user base and the maybe less than ideal or optimal adoption of various aspects of this?
Right. So listen, we're not stopping or waiting for miracles to happen. We're still continuing to prod along. Last year, Jazz alone added 11 million 4G customers. So we stand at a total base of 67 million. You talked about the profitability, but you forgot to mention that we also invested about 40 billion rupees into our capital expenditures, which is basically building more towers, increasing our database. And while you said that overall data increased by 77%, for Jazz it was close to 100%. And we're going to double our capacity this year by another 100%. So we're not stopping. We're not waiting for miracles to happen. We succeed in spite of all these challenges, not because of them. So we are not necessarily holding ourselves back. We cannot afford to deprive the populace of the country with what we think is a fundamental human right in today's age. What we are hopeful for through our interventions is that we can get there faster, right? So it's not quite like, unless I get this thing, unless the taxes come down, I'm not going to do anything. We have a good and a strange relationship with many of the governmental stakeholders. I have some empathy for their challenges. We, as a country, have one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios. And because of the success of mobile customers, they just find it as a convenient mechanism, right? So you did mention, again, Jazz profitability, but you don't mention that, literally about 1/3 of I collect goes back to the government, either through my spectrum fees or through the regulatory fees, withholding tax, the GST that I collect on behalf of the government, the corporate income tax, and everything else. So the point that we try to make with the government is don't strangle the golden goose, right? You need to basically let it live a little bit longer and you'll be better. And nobody does governmental engagements like we as a policy, as a telecom fraternity, because we genuinely believe that while we are successful, we still have a lot more to do. And that little push can actually help faster with governmental interventions. And, I was lucky enough to have a slightly limited audience with the Prime Minister. And I use the term digital emergency to impress upon him that we are actually behind where we need to be. And to use the cricketing parlance, even though this format was introduced after he left cricket, which is the power play. And I said, we are scoring singles in power play, to impress upon him that this is the time to really step up the game. And just doing the same old kind of a thing is not going to be enough. And the frustrating part for me is that there is so much opportunity, so much low-hanging fruit that we can get faster to, but we're not doing it. And the thinking, while I recognize and I have empathy for governmental decision makers, I was having a conversation with one of the senior advisors to the Prime Minister, and I said, this is an opportunity for us to leapfrog. And he said, Amer, you in private sector have the luxury of leapfrogging. In government, we can only take incremental steps. That to me is somewhat dangerous thinking. Not in digital, we cannot afford that incremental approach.
I think
one of the things that we haven't touched on are the policy areas that are preventing growth of the digital landscape. I think we need to look at that, because unless there is consistent policy, unless there are positive policies that don't hamper the growth of the entire digital space, we are not going to be able to grow. So when you block, ban at the drop of a hat, you are not encouraging people from investing in the digital landscape. You're also taking us a few years back.
Yeah.
Because like with the YouTube ban, remember 3 years, there are content developers. So we're not really talking only about coders. We're talking about content developers, we're talking about gamers. It's a big industry. And when you shut down things because you don't understand them, it is dangerous. And then the second part of this, the policy piece, is the data protection part. We are sending lots of data to the telecom operators, to the government, to technology companies, and as this continues to grow, what is being done to protect that data, personal data, also corporate data? How do I know it's being protected? How do I know it will not be misused? And this is very, very dangerous also, especially for women.
Sure.
Right?
I couldn't agree more. I'm grateful you brought up that point. There was a lot of things that we could have gotten to that we haven't been able to. But I did like the organic flow of the conversation so far.
Sure.
If you look at the screen, we've listed a number of either in development or recently approved policy devices, laws, regulations that are constantly changing. One that we haven't mentioned is the social media rules, which garnered so much controversy, quite rightly. I think the reason we listed these in this way is for us to be able to communicate to policymakers that you really do need to take a 40,000-foot view and cohere all of this together. And I think having someone like Amer Hashmi now regularly engaging with decision makers will help. But I'm not sure it'll be the only silver bullet that we'll need. We have a few questions here that I want to come to, and a bunch of questions online. So with your permission, Fakhr Saab, I'll come to you in a moment. I just wanted to list out a couple of questions that we received online. Someone asked how regulatory governance or regulatory regimes are affecting digital transformation. Is government going to simplify the regulatory regimes to attract new technologies, talent, and skills? I'll let you answer that in a very short version. The long version of the answer, I think Jehan kind of just gave, because in this case we were talking about PTA, although it's not just PTA, there's others as well. Amer, any thoughts on this?
Short answer, there's no other choice. Yeah. The government will have to do this.
We have a comment from somebody in Azad Jammu and Kashmir complaining about two telecom firms that do not have coverage in Mirpur. I won't name the two telecom firms. If either of you want to respond on behalf of the sector.
No, it's when we talk about
Telenor coverage.
we have coverage, but we can do more, and I'll tell you the reason, because I think it's important for understand. So we were sort of inquiring into AJK post the earthquake, 2005. It was another state-owned entity who was operating there. Since then, there is where in Pakistan we have 4 or 5 different rounds of spectrum allocation. In AJK, there was no rounds of spectrum allocation. So they have not released 3G or 4G spectrum, which will enable broadband connectivity. I assume that this is more referring towards that. So it's a loss, obviously, for people living there, that we're not able to serve them because we're not allowed to have more spectrum and our services, which will enable them actually.
Thank you for responding. I think that's a great sort of bit of insight as to what at the end user might be feeling and is able to associate with a given brand. But actually there are mechanics and machinations behind the scenes that inform that. Fakhr Saab, you had a contribution. Can we get a mic to Fakhr Saab?
Thank you. I have 2 questions, one to Jahara and the other one to Hashmi Saab. So my first question is that, after a lot of deliberations and discussions with the government over the last year during COVID, I think all of you have been involved from ICT and internet and telecom companies. 3 things came about very strong. One was a spectrum release, which, could help people. Second was fast-track digital payments for mass population, which could have given transparency, speed, and also saved a number of things. And third thing, not taxes at our end, taxes on consumer end, where import of duties on their cell phones or withholding tax, etc., which facilitates the consumers, may not be the company. So these three top things came above all, and government has taken a number of decisions on a number of things, but not these three things. So how do we do necessary policy and advocacy, where you said that advice is not enough, it's only the government can do. So if we are in a lock-up thing, so it is not going to come through, the road will not be there for connectivity. My second question, sir, to you is that in the past, we did had a lot of, policies on making IT parks, and a lot of professionals came into Pakistan. The Punjab government had decided to make zones, different governments for the last 15 years. One thing which always lacked, and every time we talked about it, that we are having this policy and technology zones. So if we really want to put this digital emergency, which Amer has said, and we want to do that digital acceleration on bringing in more, talent, more technology, develop Pakistan economy, only one thing needs a constitutional protection. So how are we driving? We see a lot of policies, you talked about some legislation, but somebody coming in from United States, bringing his all lifetime saving $20 million, $30 million, if the guy doesn't have a constitutional protection, and along with it, the rights of, like infringements, copyrights, these kinds of laws, which also protects his patents of things they develop here in this country. So we are not reaching there. I had the similar question to Dr. Saif earlier a couple of years back, and he was also saying we are coming with some kind of constitutional protection to these technology zones. That never came about. So
great.
How and where we are going on that?
Fantastic.
Yeah,
both questions really, really good. Janara, quick response.
So I think we need to continue to engage. We need to continue to give them advice and educate them. We cannot pull back and say, hey, they're not listening, and so we're not going to do anything. I think there are people within government who, when they understand what is needed, are pushing for it. It's just that it takes time. Anything in the government takes time. There are a lot of people on the task forces who are part of the technology industry who have been trying to explain this to them. And then, of course, it's not just the Ministry of IT, it's not just the PM's office, it's also the Ministry of Planning, it's FBR. So there are a lot of people to contend with, but we should not give up. We are continuing to talk to them, and I think one breakthrough after another will happen. So don't give up on us.
No, and I think it's important. I think, like Raza Bakir, I think Simi Kamal, Murtaza Sayyid at the State Bank, I think Abdurrahim Ahmed at the at the SECP. People all outside government, like Mubarak Siddiqui's done amazing work. He's from Sarmaya. So there's a lot of people that are pushing, but I think the question is still valid.
The good thing is that all these organizations are now engaging, not just with organizations like Pasha or with the telecom industry, but with individuals that they see are interested in this space, whether it's Mubarak, whether it's people like Tez, all of that, because they understand these are the stakeholders that need to be involved.
Hashmi Saab, response.
One answer, the IT parks and science parks that you heard of, first of all, they never had these type of incentives that the STZA has announced. It's the first time it's happened, right? Second question on constitutional rights.
Constitutional
protection.
Investors in these technology zones.
So in the first zone that we are contemplating, we're looking at a different framework from the Islamabad High Court. We're in discussion with if investors are coming, because a lot of interest is coming, right? And the reason that's coming is because land has already been allocated, and it was done in 2 weeks in Islamabad. So there's a 300-acre patch. There's Lahore Knowledge Park, सुना होगा Lahore में. I think 10 साल हो गए हैं, vacant पड़ा हुआ है. Karachi में textile city, वो भी हम सोच रहे हैं. So to move with speed with the provinces as well as the federal government, Jahan just mentioned a very important point. You have to understand our government, from planning to finance to State Bank to FBR. So the reason that I'm optimistic and I think it's moving with speed is the sessions that took place with all the adaras that I just spoke about. And I'm witness to it, and this is before my appointment. And I was just like you guys, and I still am just like you guys. Now I just represent the government. The Prime Minister sat in the meetings himself. They weren't moving. So to get the State Bank regulations, Hafiz Sheikh, I'll take the names, FBR, State Bank Governor, they all sat to understand this. So jo Janara point bata rahi hai, time, awareness and niyat that I mentioned in the beginning. I'm seeing things moving faster. I've never seen an ordinance be published this quickly. It was bulldozed through the cabinet to make people understand why tech is important. So positive signs hain. Ab implementation mein aayegi, and that'll be challenges when we start the one window. Will everyone in that ecosystem, like TES, like the telcos, like let's say IBM, Oracle, the big giants coming in, will they get the benefits that we're talking to grow the ecosystem? So that is a challenge.
So we are I believe we're way over time, but we have a bunch of questions, and I don't want us to finish until we've addressed at least a few. I'm going to read out a few questions. We'll hold your responses. Then I'll take a couple of questions from the audience as kind of a final round, and then we'll just go across the group, see who wants to respond to which question. Fasi Mehta asks about what happened to Digital Pakistan. Why is the government not putting an emergency in use of tech and mobile phone adoption? And also asks that they're saying 2021 is the year of fintech. Maybe you can answer this, Naureen. SBP and SECP have created a momentum. What should the consumers or public expect from telcos? It's a question for the telcos, but we're going to force you to answer because we don't want to. We want Irfan and Amer to come back and not feel like this is a firing range. There's a couple of questions here. I think Mehtab is with us, and Sehed, I'll come to you in just a moment. We have a question from Rizwan Khalil about when and how digital payments acceptance at merchants will happen. This will increase the usage of our digital wallets. I think he's right, and you guys both met. Maybe, Amer, you can respond to that one. Finally, we have a question from Xenia about exacerbating pre-existing inequalities. And I would add to this, you mentioned, Hashmi Saab, this bulldozing of an ordinance. In different contexts, ordinances scare people who are interested in rights and parliamentary process. And those are really slow things that obviously have not worked ideally. So whilst acknowledging the problem with going the right way, there is also new problems that the fast tracking creates. I'd like you to address that because I think is an important point. We'll start with Sehed. Sehed, please, your question. Get a mic to Sehed, please. Thank you.
Otherwise also. Thank you. My name is Seher Tariq. I work at Facebook. I'm the public policy manager for Pakistan. So I have two questions, one from Amer Hashmi Saab and then one from Aamir Ibrahim and Irfan Wahab for the telcos. So I agree with you, Amer Hashmi Saab, that legislative issues really underpin much of the malaise in the digital sector. But I think the problem is that our digital regulatory policy comes from a very coercive mindset. The list that was displayed here, I've been involved from the Facebook side in liaising with the government on several of those pieces of legislation, but they all seem to be oriented at scaring investors away.
Correct.
Now, working at Facebook, how do I convince Facebook to open an office in Pakistan when the first thing that the policy says is, if you don't do this, we will jail your executives. If you don't do this, we will, enforce so many fines on you. How can you coerce large companies to do things that are not in their either financial or political interests? And when, if ever, do we plan to shift to the India model, which India adopted 20 or 30 years ago, which was to actually incentivize companies instead of coercing them to come into the country? And do you see this kind of mental shift happening at the policy level where we move away from coercion to incentivization? And my second question for both Amer Ibrahim and Irfan Wahab is, we talked about women not having access to phones. And yes, there's a whole lot of problems around why they don't have access to phones. And actually, this is one of the problems which I feel is not legislative. This is one where you need a change in cultural mindset. And you people have been able to convince us to use, cashless banking. You've been able to convince us to use telephones, use data, watch things on our phones instead of our TVs. What have you done to convince people to get women to use cell phones? As a Pakistani, I don't remember seeing a single campaign by either one of your companies encouraging people to let women use cell phones, because we know the biggest barrier to women using cell phones is men. So what are you doing to address that?
I think that one in particular is a fantastic question, Sehed. Mehtab?
This is Mehtab. I work for the news. I have one comment and one question. My comment is there is a distortion when someone asked about AGK and GB because there is a distortion in shape of SCO. So there is a need to provide a level playing field to all stakeholders. My question is, as you know, ECC has constituted a committee on taxation issues for telcos. But every time in last 2 or 3 months, this issue got deferred. So is there any hope to the stakeholders when it will get approved from the ECC? Thank you.
Thank you, Mehtab. Ali, did you want to just make a quick addition as well? And if we're gone in 3 seconds, if anyone wants to add anything after Ali. Mudassir, okay, Ali.
Ji, Ali here. Just to add on really to Seher's and a suggestion, I think Amer Saab mentioned about legislation being one of the key factors. I would actually take a step back, and I think one of the inherent problems in technology, and I think post-COVID I've seen in Pakistan, is the lack of consultation. The coercive mindset is one angle. I actually think technology, as we've been discussing, hits everyone. And the discussion in the public sphere does not exist. The Bad Lab, excellent initiative, unfortunately is restricted to 21 people. Not in Parliament, not in the media, no one is talking about this. All these policies that you've talked about, they're literally 10 people in government and 10 people in the private sector that have put that together. I think making technology discussions ubiquitous and open is an absolute need to not just stop or manage the coercion stroke security angle, but for people to be aware of what needs to happen. I don't see that happening in Pakistan.
Thank you, Ali. Mudassir?
Well, thank you. Just to add on to a little something that you mentioned a little while ago, fast-tracking things and then, compromising on some other things related to rights, and obviously that feeds into the market and its appetite for service, etc. Surely there's a need to balance. When we say data protection and others, and there's a whole chorus of people when we're going after fake news and all these different sort of things, and we invite us in particular, the telcos, go censor this content for us. We're actually telling the industry to do something that was not even done by the government in the last 50 years. Now handing it over to that, we know that people are perturbed by fake news and everything, but the key thing is that if you ask the industry, or larger, we ask Facebook to censor our content, to block fake news. So what will they do? We're certainly handing, for the sake of a little bit of security, essential liberty into their hands. So this fast tracking does compromise those things, and it must be taken in that way by the government. Industry needs fast work, but industry needs the consumers on a larger scale with all of these things intact, because we also face exposure from global regulations and other things. So just a little add on to what you just said.
No, I think that's a very valuable one. That last round of questions and comments was fantastic, and I'm glad we stayed on. Amer, Hashmi Saab, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, and you'll forgive me and not break off our friendship on this. On the ECC subcommittee on looking at taxation issues to the telecom sector, unlike a lot of discussions that we tend to have, that's a very specific ask. Would it be unfair of us to maybe request you to become a champion to get that thing over the line? I know it's not your domain, but certainly given how much trust you've engendered within decision makers, I would love if we could get some sort of an indication of your championing of getting that past the line. Whatever the conclusion is, I think, the conclusion should be fair, and nobody's asking, zero taxes, but if you could maybe commit to
Sorry,
helping
this is
on
a
that
subcommittee in the ECC for tax policy revisions?
It's to address issues in taxation policy, specifically with respect to the telecom sector. That's what Mehtab just mentioned.
Telecom, huh?
Yeah. So I'll take that note-making as a sign that you will follow up and take that forward as an action point? Amer
There
Ibrahim.
has been some movement on it.
Okay.
So there is an intent to gradually start reducing the withholding tax and harmonize GST. It's the outcome of a number of months of efforts by a number of stakeholders, including the telecom players and the community. And I must give credit to Hafiz Sheikh Saab, who's listened very patiently to us, our own Minister Aminul Haq Saab, who has championed this thing, and Dr. Ishrat, who's been kind of coordinating the efforts. So yes, we see some reduction. Hopefully it will get cemented today at the cabinet and then implemented from June onwards. But we just want to put the pressure on that because we don't want it to be let up, and a lot more needs to be done.
And that's why I'm kind of putting the ball
As
in.
an overall context, bhi de do what Ali meant. Ali sir?
No.
I think we have to be very pragmatic and understand how the government of Pakistan functions. It's an old structured government, and we all know the processes. You know how the ministries. It's an electoral form. You need reps from the upper and lower houses. So ये जो concept है कि इनको engage करो. 10 साल I've tried at the highest levels. Our think tank was quite powerful and still is, right? तो वो जो public sector debates होती हैं, where you get the government reps with open mindedness. I keep emphasizing, and I think one takeaway, Sharaf, is mindset change takes time, which Janara has mentioned. She's seen a progression in 20 years. तो जो mindset change government में आएगा, वो ऐसे ही आएगा where think tanks like yourself will push the solutions. Unko engage karna, they don't have the solutions, I'll be dead honest, because I've sat in their meetings, not just now in the last couple of months, but even in the last 20 years that I've come back to Pakistan. So, agar is forum se policies push hoingi, right? That's stronger because though over there they're ready to implement what you're telling them. They won't come up with innovative ideas. Aapka beginning mein question tha, will the government be proactive? Why wasn't it proactive with COVID? It's not their job to be proactive, right? So we have to understand the mindset change. Now, how to change the government thinking, that's a separate discussion, not over here.
Got it.
So I think
we want to build towards a conclusion. I would love a response to Seher's second question in particular. Naureen, let's start with you, then we'll come to Amer, then we'll go to Irfan, and we'll give the last word to Jehan. Address whatever questions you heard or comments, and please.
So the question on telcos leading fintech or fintech being leading 2021, I think fintech should have led even 2020. And telcos being the biggest fintechs, I think it's a railroad already set for them. But I think what I would say to the telcos is open up a little more to partner with the smaller fintechs. Open up a little more with data maybe, so that fintechs who are actually working in the space can actually capitalize on it and be more symbiotic in what you guys are trying to achieve. So that would be my say. I don't know where Digital Pakistan is right now. I think these talks right now are a part of it. And it's happening in fragments with the SCCP, with the SPP. But whether or not that policy initiative that was taken, a couple of years back, where that is, I really can't comment on it right now.
Thank you. Just on data, to add a question from Hamza Khan, and this is the last one I'll add. They're continuing to come in, and I think it's important to address because that's engagement, and that's really what we want to do. Hamza Khan says, PTI currently has a policy for telecom on-premise data platforms where data is only allowed to reside in Pakistan physically. However, we need to quickly move our data to cloud. Any policy shift is a question mark. Now, I know that this might be seen in the context of the Facebooks and the Googles and the YouTubes, but it actually obviously applies also to telco data, which I think is substantial from a business and social intelligence perspective. Irfan, your thoughts on that and on any of the other issues that were raised, particularly maybe Seher's question.
I'll try to answer that as well. On the data first, I think it's important to distinguish between what is the rationale for asking all data to be in-house, right? If we talk about digital transformation, and if you have to really transform society, and I'm not just talking about the government, we need to really open up, because now the world has changed. Small businesses or even large businesses cannot afford, who are not in technology space, to have their own data centers or to host things in country where you have so many open source data centers available. So I think we should be a lot more open in allowing that, and I think there's some development there, but we need to be a little bit more progressive. When it comes to some customer-specific data, I think is okay, and it's a prerogative of the government actually and regulators to ask on-premise or at least in country. So there could be a model which could be hybrid, depending on what sort of utilization you're thinking of. But we need to really progress because the world is moving there. Everything will be on cloud, and then we need to really embrace it. Just on the one key recommendation actually out of this forum, I agree on the opportunity in the financial services or financial inclusion. But just one reflection, I mean, I think it's a great initiative when we look at Roshan digital accounts. We just celebrated $500 million worth of deposits. Great. What is the key success for that? The reason for that is seamless experience of overseas Pakistanis who can do KYC online.
Yeah.
If they can do it online, why can't people living in Pakistan are allowed to do KYC online? And why we have to go and do biometric and all those? So I think that's just some reflection for our regulators to think about it, because this will really unleash the opportunity. Then on the female inclusion and participation, I totally agree that this is a huge issue. But I don't agree that we have not done enough campaigns, or maybe we have done some campaigns, so it may not be enough. I can think of 3-4 specific programs where we have taken, but first thing is the awareness. So as Telenor, as an organization, we have set specific goals, which we are also public goals committed towards GSMA, at how we will improve the female inclusion, both on the telco side, in terms of mobile phones in their hands, but also in the financial inclusion. And we are sort of internally following it up. But we also run a number of programs. For example, I can think of iChamp program, which was, because we have to build around use cases, why females, there are social taboo around mobile phones, and how and why kids can really leverage it. And this is pre-COVID. We've been running it for 3 years, where we have said that the phone, because there was a resistance coming from teachers and parents. And we run this on-ground activation. We've reached out every year close to 600,000 kids across Pakistan. The last program was actually, the winner was from, I would say, underprivileged parts of Balochistan, a girl from Hazara community, which she came as a winner in a grand finale, which actually happened in our headquarters in Norway. It was telecasted on 2 TV channels, just to encourage and inspire other girls to leverage mobile phone for education. We've been also signing up a lot of retailers, female retailers, to go into those communities, because going to those markets could be an issue. And we have now, quite a sizable population across Pakistan, even in Karachi, where they can go door to door in those flats, to Gilgit and Hazara, where I met those retailers who are going in those communities. So I think it's a journey. There are social issues, but at least what we're trying to do is to address those issues as much as we can.
That's really helpful. Feel free, Jehan and Amer, in your closing discussions, also to maybe address the bulldozing and the impact or the compromise that entails. Jehan, your concluding sort of responses and thoughts.
So I think there's still a lot to be done, and I think that the conversations with government needs to continue. The policies need to be looked at by multi-stakeholder groups. We often hear of policies just being announced and then being taken to cabinet. That shouldn't be the case. Why not bring people together, as we did? We have done this in the past, where multiple stakeholders from civil society, from industry, and from government get together and work on what is needed, and then a policy is formulated, and then the draft is circulated. I think more of that needs to happen, because very often people in government do not know what's needed. And people in civil society and industry do know, because they engage with the whole world on these issues and they know what's needed. So I think if the government can start doing that again, it used to happen, but I don't know why it's more closed. And if organizations like the PTA, I don't know what pushes them to block, ban, and close things without first consultation with stakeholders. That is necessary. I mean, if a teenager commits suicide because he was playing a game, doesn't mean you're now going to shut down the gaming industry. For heaven's sake, it's sad that that happened, but you need to find a solution that will not shut down the livelihoods of many and also affect the economy of this country. So I think there is a lot more engagement that's required by decision makers within the government. We don't see them as the enemy, but At the same time, they need to see us as friends as well.
I like that one.
Yeah, that's a great
thought
note.
you would.
That's a very good power line. Okay. I'll start with addressing Sahir's question, and I wouldn't just gloss over what we have done as an organization or not. I'd like to highlight one thing, which is around smart schools, where we educated 40,000 girls in Islamabad and 900 teachers on how to use technology for advancing their education. But the sad reality is, whatever we have done, even though we have dedicated tariffs for women, and more will come this year around Women's Day, the sad reality is we are not where we need to be. I'd welcome your participation as a sounding board. Come join us and let us know what can be done. We are very open and humble about where we are lacking. So that being said, this is somewhat similar to what I have talked about earlier in terms of, let's call women inclusion, whether it's in fintech or using internet, an emergency. Likewise, digital, I call that as an emergency. We keep on glossing over the fact that we've got great opportunity and we can do 5 billion in software export and we can do this, and these are all things in future, right? Where we are, we're scoring singles in power play. And that is not going to change unless there is a very strong intervention with an extremely pointed focus led directly by the Prime Minister, not reliant and dependent on various other ministries. Just like many other countries have done this thing, yes, and I don't want to politicize or hide behind digital Pakistan, but whatever we may call it a smart nation, change the vocabulary if you want to. But unless we go with the mandate of a smartphone in every hand and broadband in every single home, we are not moving forward. You can call it connectivity layer, you can look at it from many different angles, but the sad reality is we are 23 out of 25 countries in Asia when it comes to internet readiness. That is not a position where we want to be. We're 76 out of 100 countries in the readiness. We have weak, non-reliable internet. And if we keep on taking that approach that you also initially took, they're making a lot of money and let's milk them further, I know that wasn't your intent, but if we take that intent, we're not moving forward. We're just moving backwards, and then there are many other things that many other people over here have already highlighted. We don't want to be known as Banistan. We've got to open up.
I think on a kind of things that we need to do, that is certainly among the very top, that we shouldn't be projecting a negative approach to any of these problems. With that, I think, with great thanks to you, Irfan, Naureen, Amer, Hashmi, Amer, Ibrahim, and Jehan, and also especially to those folks that braved COVID-19 and joined us today in a very limited audience, those that are watching online from the safety of their homes. Thanks to all of you for participating in this conversation. This is not usually we think of these events as the end. This is not the end. This is actually the beginning of a conversation that we hope to continue to be able to support and engage with, inshallah. With many thanks to everyone that were watching. I hand things back to Ibrahim Shamsi.
All right, thank you so much, Musharraf. And this is exactly the kind of conversation we wanted. This is just the beginning, as Musharraf pointed out, where we have government and industry leaders and entrepreneurs and the telcos talking about all these issues. I mean, this was such a wide-ranging conversation. I mean, for instance, on the tax, I know this has been a long-standing issue with telcos. It's great that there's forward movement, that GST will be consolidated, for instance. But I think my biggest takeaway here was Amer Hashmi's subs, which was, we know that the government is a slow-moving beast. We know that we have very little time. Things happen incrementally, but there is a digital emergency, and I think Jahanara's point also needs to be included here, which is that it shouldn't be at the cost of better regulation and consultation and policy that's smarter and more inclusive as well. In terms of inclusiveness, we're getting a lot of comments and questions, and it's a pity we can't take all of them. Some of them online, whether it's marginalized areas or women, they need to be included in these policies as well. We cannot exclude them. And I think one of the last things I want to point out here is that there's another important point that Naureen Hyat also pointed out. We know that government it takes the lead, it takes responsibility, as Mr. Hashmi pointed out as well. So for instance, in terms of data and centralized data and access to it, and where the privacy of citizens is, that's another important point. Thank you so much for participating. We have lunch now. Please, you're invited. The conversation continues with Hafiz.
I should take this off before I start walking off. That was fun. Yeah.
I think it went okay.